When disaster strikes, it reveals not just the vulnerabilities in our built environment, but also the opportunity to rebuild with more intention. In the wake of the devastating LA wildfires earlier this year, conversations about recovery have expanded into questions of long term resiliency, equitable redevelopment, and what kinds of governance structures are needed to get there. To unpack these issues, I'm joined by Dr. Minjee Kim, an assistant professor in urban planning at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Minjee's research sits at the intersection of real estate development, public finance, and urban planning, making her uniquely suited to guide us through this moment. She's advised the LA County Blue Ribbon Commission on post-fire recovery and authored a memo exploring how LA could structure a redevelopment authority modeled after efforts in cities like San Francisco, New York, and Cincinnati. In today's episode, we discuss what LA can learn from past large-scale recovery efforts, how different governance models impact land use outcomes, and why we must think beyond parcel-by-parcel rebuilding if we want to build a more resilient, equitable future. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. Today, we're going to talk about fire recovery in LA, a topic that integrates resiliency and real estate development and community dynamics. You have a unique perspective when it comes to all of those things because of your background as an urban planner, but now as an academic who looks at development through this unique lens of finance and planning together. And you've been in LA for some time now, and I'm curious how your experiences have shaped how you think about LA's recovery from the fires that took place in January.
Well, I literally moved right before the LA fire. So I moved in mid-December, and then
Mm.
within less than a month, this happened. I was very new to LA, and it was a very surprising introduction and very chaotic one. But all the more that my background and research agenda does shape how I um, received the situation. In all my academic career, I've been studying large scale transformations of urban, suburban, and rural land, as you mentioned, at this intersection of real estate development planning, as well as an understanding of how these projects are financed. So that would include urban redevelopment projects that transforms like hundreds of acres into shiny new developments, which was the focus of my dissertation in the South Boston waterfront district in Boston, or developments of like wholesale new communities and towns and suburban and urban landscapes called master planned communities. And so my research has been, on this idea or question of, what are the potentials and risks associated with such grand schemes? That being said, when the LA fires came about, as devastating as they were, in my eyes, this also presented an opportunity to think large scale. As we know, the great fires that happened in the 19th century did result in, opportunities for a wholesale transformation of urban cores in American cities, right? So I saw this as an opportunity to think about urban planning, development in the long term, and with in mind resiliency as well as fire resiliency, but also in terms of what is a good, sustainable form of urban development.
Mm. And before we start creating that parallel between master plan developments and urban redevelopment and where we're at with the LA recovery process, I was hoping you could sort of speak to that, being local to the area. What has been the process of rebuilding, and how is the pace of rebuilding in the Palisades and Altadena impacting residents?
So the answer to that question is mostly coming from following up with local news and what's happening on the ground. So debris cleanup has been reported to be on track or even faster than originally planned, with most of the parcels have completed their cleanup, meaning the property owners can start to rebuild if they wish to. A very recent newspaper article said that although they're cleared for rebuilding, these parcels had not been tested for their toxins in soil, so resulting in questions about applications and risks. So I think that's also pushing back some residents or previous residents to come back. I would say that it's really a patchwork of relocating elsewhere or staying and trying to rebuild. So LA County has a tracker for building permits issued and how
Mhm.
many are under review. I just checked it yesterday for Altadena. As of yesterday, 46 building permits were issued. In Palisades, City of LA does not have like an equivalent tracker for permitting, but a news release by the mayor's office said 30 permits were issued and then hundreds were being considered, or 180 were being considered. So
Mhm.
that's where actual rebuilding has been so far. The federal government and FEMA didn't require any soil testing. I think the city and the county will step up and fill in that gap in the coming months. They're also doing their parts in terms of setting up one-stop shop for permitting and all of the sort of logistical needs for residents to rebuild, and then also fast tracking development permits if they are almost exactly the same as what stood before. So yeah, city and county have been doing their best, but at the same time, a lot of news reporting do show that there have been speculative real estate
Mhm.
purchases happening, and also like residents that just don't want to return to it because it'll take time to rebuild those communities, not just the physical community, but for the community to be back in its old glory. It will
Mhm.
take years, if not decades. Some people just don't have that time, money, or patience. So they've also been selling their lots. And like New York Times did a really good series in April about the land and properties being up for sale in these areas. What they found, at least in the Palisades, was that the burned lots for sale aren't that much lower than their previous value. The reporting said maybe 25% discount, but it's still high.
That's interesting because it seems that there are individuals who have taken the onus to put forth permits. It seems like maybe around 80 have been approved in both of these areas. And at the same time, thousands of houses have been impacted, and the greater community itself, to your point, has been impacted as well. I'm curious, how should LA, beyond its consolidated or expedited permitting process, be thinking about structuring itself to facilitate redevelopment? And why is the structure of recovery so important to the long term resiliency of this community? And why doesn't business as usual work?
So on that front, LA County Supervisor Lindsay Horvath created this Blue Ribbon Commission. The purpose of the committee is to advise the LA County supervisors in terms of how to structure rebuilding and recovery moving forward, right? So that was the genesis of the Blue Ribbon Commission. And they just recently issued their initial set of recommendations. And then a couple weeks ago, the UCLA research team also published the background research that fed into the Blue Ribbon Commission's report. The two pieces together were released on June 11th or 12th. The main recommendation of the Blue Ribbon Commission is to establish regional entities for resilient rebuilding and long-term fire protection. That is the first recommendation that's put forward by the Blue Ribbon Commission. Then there's two different components to that, the rebuilding and regional entity. So the commission is recommending a creation of the Resilient Rebuilding Authority, which we'll get to. Also, there is a component of what's referred to as the Fire Control District, which is more about preventive measures, partnering with existing owners and working with other government entities to create, like, for example, fuel breaks at the interface of urban and wildland. That's more of the preventive measure, not so much the recovery and
Mhm.
rebuilding process. So those two are not completely separate, but a little bit different. The committee laid out a multitude of justifications for why this entity is needed, right? Most of them are practical. So, why do we need a centralized agency or regional recovery agency for sustainable rebuilding? There's practical justifications for it in the Blue Ribbon Commission report. To synthesize the key points, first of all, like it allows communities to tap into financing tools, most importantly, tax incremental financing, among others. It also allows for efficient use of public land and resources. For example, the Redevelopment Authority could facilitate bulk purchases for materials and resources and
Mhm.
consolidate some of the service provisions, centralized management of permitting and construction. Like those are the reasons why The Blue Ribbon Commission, strongly recommends creating centralized redevelopment authority. But if I could add my thoughts, I think the real excitement and opportunity and reason why there's a justification for a centralized authority is that we could be more creative in our rebuilding
Hmm.
process. For example, we could pull land as a source of financing. We could reconfigure parcel lines and create resilient infrastructure. We could purchase and consolidate private land for the same purpose or for more efficient use of service delivery or for financing infrastructure that's sorely needed in these areas or for cleanups. So there's a lot more creative and innovative out of the box approaches that you could
Hmm.
take if there is a centralized rebuilding agency empowered to do so as opposed to, just building parcel by parcel and like for like.
What are some of the benefits? You spoke to some generally, but I was wondering if you'd be more specific about building through a master plan approach as opposed to parcel by parcel. And are those two things inherently in conflict with each other, given that some people have decided to move forward with a parcel by parcel approach and have permitted their own parcel?
To answer your question, are they inherently in conflict with each other? I wouldn't view it that way. So, as you mentioned, like people have already gone in and started building like for like. So,
Mhm.
does that completely negate the opportunity to build master plans and create master plans? I don't think so, because there are still opportunities and areas that could receive larger scale intervention within the communities. We need to look at the land ownership map and see if there are larger parcels that could be eligible for a larger scale intervention. So the fact that some homeowners have already gone in and started rebuilding doesn't completely eliminate the opportunity to master plan, but at the same time, it also undermines the scale of the intervention master planned approach.
I like the idea that there are larger parcels and maybe those that are closer to commercial corridors that could receive more density
Mhm.
and help with not just the rebuilding crisis, but the housing crisis that there is
Mm,
in LA County.
yes, exactly, exactly.
To what extent does the redevelopment of this area need new infrastructure? We typically think about the houses being burnt down, but when it comes to power lines, roadways, water systems, what is your understanding of the need for public investment in shared infrastructure for this area?
I would say it's all of the above based on my participation with the Blue Ribbon Commission's effort. It's water, it's power, it's road, and it's everything. And so the committee has put forward recommendation for a potential financing mechanism
Mhm.
for providing the enhanced infrastructure. It's not just normal infrastructure; it's the enhanced infrastructure needs that these communities have because of their
Mm.
vulnerability. So that's been highlighted in the Blue Ribbon Commission report.
Now, you wrote a memo speaking to the ways that LA County itself could structure an entity to facilitate the redevelopment. And you dive into three different governance models, pulling from unique case studies. I was wondering if you could just help our listeners understand how these governance structures actually facilitate large scale development, whether it be master plans or urban redevelopment of dozens of blocks at a time.
So, to put the memo into context, this was an internal memo that was shared with the committee, the Blue Ribbon Commission's subcommittee that was working on this idea of regional redevelopment authority, and I was providing some case studies that could help the committee understand the governance structures of large scale rebuilding efforts, as well as how successful or not these entities have been. So I did select three very different types of authorities. The first one is the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority that redeveloped the Trans-Bay Transit Center in downtown San Francisco. And the second one is the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation that was created after 9/11 and was in charge of coordinating the redevelopment of Ground Zero and the office buildings around it, And then the last one, which is very different, and it's not a government entity, it's a private nonprofit entity called Cincinnati Center City Development Corporation. So those are the three entities that I've selected for committee's consideration, not necessarily saying that, oh, like you should follow this model or that model, but to highlight the complexity of the
Hmm.
rebuilding processes as well as how different each and every single cases are because these are unique, these are complex, these are, excruciatingly difficult situations to navigate. Therefore, each case will result in a very unique pathway for rebuilding.
I thought what was interesting was the difference in ownership or authority basis for each of these. So, Transbay as a joint powers authority owned the land, and that was
Right.
their power in being able to sell that and enter a joint development agreement.
Hmm.
Um, I was wondering if you can talk through the other two and elaborate on that, because who is this entity sort of dictates their power, and if they own the land, also dictates what they can do and how much control they have over the future.
Right. Given the interest of limited time, the point of land ownership is really the key. So let's try to focus on that. These three entities are very different in that regard. Transbay Joint Powers Authority owned the land that was previously owned by Caltran, which was a former Embarcadero highway damaged during the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. So the land that the freeway was on that was demolished was transferred to Transbay Joint Powers Authority. So they had the power, and they also had land use regulatory power over such land. So that really gave them a lot of power in terms of dictating what developments happen on this
Hmm.
site and how much leverage they had in working with private real estate developers. The TJPA ended up financing over $500 million out of the total $2 billion project by leasing or selling this publicly owned land. And that really was the core source of their power. Versus the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation is a completely different story. They did not own any of the office buildings that were demolished. That was actually owned by a private developer, as well as a lot of the land was the Port Authority's land, ground lease 99 years to this real estate mogul in New York City. Lower Manhattan Development Corporation did not have control of the land, but they benefited from a single consolidated ownership under Port Authority. So they were able to facilitate and sort of influence what's going on and coordinate the rebuilding process because the land was under a single or largely under single ownership.
Ownership.
So that was the key, although the corporation itself was not the owner of land. The Lower Manhattan Development Corporation was largely like a facilitator and a coordinator of the rebuilding effort as opposed to taking on a more developer role, which is a good segue to our final case, which is a model where this private nonprofit organization has been acting as a developer. The Cincinnati Center City Development Corporation is almost like it is a real estate development and finance firm, but
Hmm.
created with the minds of revitalizing downtown Cincinnati. Again, it's not a government entity, but they have maintained extremely close relationship and coordination with the city of Cincinnati. And
Hmm.
that includes reviewing and revising and shaping their redevelopment plan with the city of Cincinnati, but at the same time, getting a lot of financial and political support from city of Cincinnati for enabling such projects to
Hmm.
happen. And then because they're a private development entity, they go in and buy properties that they feel are core catalytic sites for redevelopment. So they've been proactively buying land in downtown Cincinnati to have control over land and influence the larger scale redevelopment and revitalization of Cincinnati. So
Hmm.
these are sort of three very different models and having very different powers and authorities in approaching redevelopment.
And it seems like all three of them, even with the Cincinnati agency being private, have been sanctioned or heavily supported by their public sector partners.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
impossible without that public-private partnership.
Mm. And From the way that you're talking about it, I can see the breadcrumbs being dropped of what you think LA should be doing in terms of their redevelopment authority. But could you lay that out? What lessons learned from each of these case studies sort of leads to a specific type of organization to lead this effort?
So first of all, the Blue Ribbon Commission also hasn't answered this question of like, should there be one entity for
Mm,
developing Palisades and Altadena together, or should there be separate entities? And, also learning from the case studies, I think there's, benefit and or arguments for either one, right? If you have one agency, it does not duplicate the management and organizational capacity that's needed for creating and implementing the projects. It's also centralized entity that governments and other stakeholders and residents can deal with. So that makes it a little easier in terms of who's responsible. Having one entity would provide similar levels of professional expertise and administrative
mm,
capacity to both areas, as opposed to if you have two completely different agencies, you can't really control for that capacity and expertise that's available. There's obviously reasons why we don't want a uniform approach to rebuilding the two places because they're just very different places. Palisades being very upper scale and wealthy community. Altadena is a working class, a much more diverse and denser community. That in and of itself results in different types and costs for recovery. But at the same time, because of the two different political status and power of the community, it might lead to competing of resources and expertise even within one agency and having different levels of attention and resources allocated to these two areas. Also, Altadena is in an unincorporated LA County versus Palisades is within city of LA. So the staff that will be working for these two communities will inherently be dealing primarily with either the county or the city. There's obviously pros and cons, but if it was up to me and if based on the complexity of large scale redevelopment that I've been studying, it would not make sense to duplicate
mhm.
the organizational capacity and institutional knowledge needed for large scale rebuilding, especially given that these two communities are so close together. My approach would be to create a single entity with two clearly designated branches for the Palisades and the Altadena area, having the staff within the agencies or check in and coordinate with each other to make sure that they're sharing resources and knowledges, but at the same time, they're moving the pace and making sure that they're on the same page in terms of the overall redevelopment approach.
I'm sort of thinking about how each of these communities is different in their own rights. You spoke to that in terms of density and diversity and the scale of development it's currently seeing. If we look at a Cincinnati model in which there wasn't solidified, or I would say even consolidated ownership of land with a single owner or even with a government owner, this
Mhm.
model seems the most interesting to me because there is that need to organize ownership of land to carry out a more holistic development approach. And with that comes this sort of balancing act between the political accountability that's in place and the public control versus the private sector flexibility and speed for them to acquire parcels.
Mhm.
And ownership of land is always a touchy subject. How was Cincinnati successfully able to do this? And are there any lessons learned that you see LA could draw from if they were to move in this approach?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for pointing that out, which brings me to highlight the point that the Cincinnati approach was only possible because the downtown business community was so united and they
Mhm.
put money in, creating this agency. So without that private sector sort of coming together, Cincinnati model is not possible.
Mhm.
So for this 3CDC model to be replicated elsewhere, it really has to be the local business community coming together and chipping in resources, then coordinating with the public sector, which would then allow for similar sort of redevelopment pathway, which it seems not that replicable elsewhere. But that being said, I think the model and the case really highlights the importance of bringing in business sector in the rebuilding process, right?
Mm,
So if this special purpose authority for LA is to be created, then coordinating with local business community, especially in and around Palisades and Altadena, but also the philanthropic organizations that exist in LA that are, eager to help in rebuilding and recovery process. I think bringing in those key stakeholders along the way and having them taking part in establishing a redevelopment authority is going to allow for a somewhat similar approach to the 3 CDC model. And then making sure there's as much flexibility as possible as
mm,
a quasi-governmental agency, and having purchase power, but also having the eminent domain power, which has been traditionally with community redevelopment agencies for similar types of urban redevelopment projects. The other key point of the special purpose authority is that they're subject to less transparency and less accountability for enabling faster implementation and flexible spending of their budget, right? So that's why these entities have been traditionally referred to as quasi-governmental agencies.
mhm,
And so enabling quasi-governmental structures, but at the same time bolstering transparency is going to be the key in balancing. So making
mhm,
sure that the decisions that is made by the authority is published and the process is publicly available, allowing for multiple sort of opportunities for public input and participation would build in that culture of transparency that would mitigate some of the accountability risks that persist with special purpose agencies.
hmm. Yeah, it seems that when there is a agreement between private and public sector as to what the goals and objectives are, it's easier to move in that direction with the transparency you're talking about when it comes to processes and outcomes. Sort of as we're wrapping up the conversation, I'm curious, you've spoken to policies that could help with recovery, whether that's the city's ability to fast track permits or with the commission's understanding and solidification of a governance entity to help development move forward. What other types of policy reforms at the city, county, or state level should be looked at seriously? We just heard about CEQA overhaul at the state
Mhm.
level to help expedite redevelopment. What are some of the other types of policies that you see playing a big role in how fast and efficiently LA is able to rebuild these areas?
And so for the Blue Ribbon Commission, they're considering like special assessments, additional fee on properties that are most vulnerable to risks in collecting that fee for fire preventive measures.
Hmm.
That would also be additional tax burden or fee burden on property owners in the hillside communities. Um, and that's where I think what I was referring to earlier about land pooling and land readjustment idea can be
Mm,
really powerful. So, for example, if hypothetically this redevelopment authority purchases land at fair market prices from the existing owners and then set aside certain land for sales proceeds or lease and redistribute and finance infrastructure projects with the sales proceeds of this land, and then design the parcels of the private properties and reallocate the parcel. So basically, private landowners would have smaller land to some extent, but with actual infrastructure financed through the sale of the land. So that's like a more of a pie in the sky
mhm,
example, but it is conceivable and has been done elsewhere,
mm.
in international context. So that would be applicable in the Palisades and the Altadena area, but I don't think we're there yet.
A sort of coordinated effort to buy these individual parcels to then resell them. Seems like
Mhm.
a large undertaking that definitely needs an entity to lead it. As you're following up on this memo that you wrote, what are some things that you want to maybe not just communicate to the Blue Ribbon Commission, but to your fellow residents of LA about this redevelopment and maybe the opportunistic, but also realistic pathways there are to move forward when the challenge seems so big?
I think my main message would be to think big rather than think parcel by parcel. especially looking at historical examples of how, disasters have disrupted and destroyed cities and how rebuilding has taken place historically,
Hmm.
will does give us inspirations for how to move forward. And that's why examples like the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority, Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, the Great Fires of the 19th century, I think all of those recovery efforts demonstrate that after disasters, a reimagination of urban core is possible. So that would be my main message for LA County and city residents and community members. We are presented with an opportunity, and so let's be creative and reimagine what City of LA and the broader LA region looks like in the face of increased wildfire risks, and what large scale interventions we can implement in order to make LA more fire resilient.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.